Welcome to another one of our online Ignatian Conversations and our Discernment in Action series. I am Mr. Bob Steffen, the Director of Ignatian Formation and Adult Spirituality at Loyola, and excited to be joined with my colleague, Mr. Christian Astran, again for another one of these conversations. Today, we're coming together with the topic of discernment in crisis, one that we believe is so timely, particularly for all the events that really have happened over the course of 2020. So many different crises that have occurred that have required leadership, response, discernment, and prompted particularly by current events in Washington, the actions there that have just happened in the last few days. Causing, I think, for all of us, a time to pause, to reflect, and to say, what can we learn? And how are we all called to discern and to act in times of crisis? Um, Christian brought this topic to me, and so I'll turn it over to him to say a little bit more about some of his thoughts and what might be most important to consider as we begin this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. It's great to be back on here with you. I think the reason I reached out and I thought about doing another one of these conversations is I just completed the first semester teaching our Developing as a Leader course here at Loyola High School. And one of those topics that we really talked about during the semester and that the guys really got engaged with was the idea that leadership can unfold and really flourish during crisis. Um, and that leaders have a calling to be prepared to act and respond to crises as an active part of their skill set that they're called to develop. One of those really powerful ideas that we have in the course that I pull from one of our textbooks is that servant leaders are always in training. You're never fully developed as a leader. And one of those areas that we really profoundly talked about was that you can train yourself to learn to step into moments of crisis and to learn to be effective in a crisis when other people might want to shut down or respond or not be able to take that first step back into the arena, and that if you really prepare yourself actively for that, you're going to be able to respond in a dynamic way when so many other people might just not know what to do next.
I think it's so important to think about. And I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on how we prepare ourselves, in a sense, for those moments. Because what you just were saying reminds me of, I believe, the way that St. Ignatius kind of structured the formation of Jesuits, growing out of his own experience of being in a number of different points of crisis, and then in trying to prepare the future Jesuits for any kinds of circumstance, intentionally running them through experiences in initial formation that would test them, that would stretch them, that would put them into places of challenge or difficulty. Because I think one point is that in a time of crisis, people act differently, right? We
Mm-hmm.
all have an idea of how we're going to act, but the challenge is action is not just a function of the mind or the thought or previous intellectual conjecture. Rather, it's emotion, it's physical, it's in the moment, right? How will you act? And the more that you're trained to integrate all those elements of yourself, the more effectively you'll be able to make a decision that's grounded not just in, let's say, a concept or in fear or in an emotional response, but rather one that balances all of them. And I think that was part of the goal of how Ignatius wanted, Jesuits to be trained through formation, and maybe a little bit of what you're trying to convey to your students as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love how you're talking about Ignatius building in moments of crisis to almost, I think one of those profound things I talk about with the guys in my course is that leaders have to be willing to learn how to fail themselves in small settings, and failure often brings with it crisis or the need to change things. I wanted to kind of highlight a quote to bring into the conversation from one of our course texts, Spiritual Leadership by Leonard Duhan. He's a professor emeritus up at my alma mater, where I'm doing my PhD in leadership at Gonzaga. And this quote of his is that crisis is a turning point when a new kind of judgment is needed. That is why leadership theorists suggest that leadership emerges in times of crisis. Without crisis, we generally have simple management. In other words, leadership is the combination of vision and the skills that empower a person to handle crises creatively, caringly, and productively. Crises, like most changes, are now different than they used to be. In fact, many former crises are now handled proactively as part of good management, and some former crisis management skills are now left in disuse. Contemporary leaders know that their effectiveness is linked to confronting crises with style and insight. And I think that quote speaks really powerfully to what I reflect on in the course, and in some ways what I even do in my own leadership practice, is that you have to have the ability to be thinking two steps ahead of where you're at all the time. You have to be willing to take things as they come and incorporate that into your larger vision, rather than trying to feel like you have a sense of controlling the outcomes of anything that's going to happen. And I think that's a really kind of effective way of, if you're going to be a person who's in a position of leadership, whether that's just over your own life or other people's around you, you have to be willing to just take the crises as they come and make sure that you're an adaptable enough person, and that your own personal mission is adaptable enough to take those crises in and make the most of the opportunities that come with them.
No, I think that's so true, especially when we consider that in a moment of crisis, we often don't have all the information, and that we're making decisions based on the best available information about the situation and about who we are, right? That's partly why I think that a moment of crisis can be so revelatory, because it reveals kind of the fundamental principles. It doesn't reveal people's ability to carefully consider every different option and go through them. It shows, like, at heart, when you act, how will you act, and in which direction will you go? And I think as well, that point about failure is so significant, because um, a few of us, certainly not St. Ignatius, certainly not myself, will respond in the way that we want in those moments of crises. St. Ignatius in the battle at Pamplona um, had that stubborn, pride-filled action of charging on, right, in the midst of battle. We don't know all the details. We don't know if other soldiers might have lost their lives as a result of that decision, right, to stand your ground. We know the physical suffering that Ignatius endured, but that decision was of a type that, driven by pride, and really not that specific context perhaps of being in battle, but that acting out of pride or out of fear of being wrong is something that I think all of us can confront or can experience, right? And what you were talking about in being able to be open to admit failure and also to trust is so important, right? It's something so surprising. I've often been admired a lot of the wisdom of 12-step spirituality, for example, which talks about the importance of surrendering your own ego. Not so you're not handing over your own decision-making responsibility, but rather by freeing yourself of believing that you're always in control, you are better able to respond to what's actually occurring, because you're not projecting in constantly what you want the situation to be, but you're rather accepting it as it is. So much, I think, of what you're saying resonates with that. And we're in the midst of a whole context right now of examples of that.
Yeah, and just to be, I think, explicitly clear, without making it a political statement, is that I think what we witnessed this past week, in the storming of our Capitol was, a leader, someone, I won't call him a leader, somebody who, our president, Donald Trump, um, soon to be former president, placed in a position of authority who doesn't know how to handle failure, right? And we can see that if people who don't have the formation, or at least are willing to take the steps to try and do the formative work to be a leader, when they're placed in a position where you need leadership, the consequences can be really catastrophic. And I don't, and I think that anyone who wants to be in a position of leadership has to be willing to take part of that burden up with them, right? Like that's part of that self work of crisis, is that you have to be willing to know up front that you're going to fail when you step into those positions. And um, I think one of the sayings is that, in sports and a lot of things, that failure is not an option. And I think that the Ignatian way to me in so many ways is willing to admit that failure is always an option, but that doesn't matter because we're still going to do what we're going to do because it's the right thing. Um, I go back to, I think you and I have brought this up in some other contexts, that idea of Ignatian, like indifference, or the willingness to go forward with something, even if the outcome means the end of everything you care for, because it's the right way. And I always just come back to, and I brought this up to the guys in the course, Ignatius being willing to say, in his own lifetime, that if the entire Jesuit order were to be taken away from me, I would need a day to kind of like cry myself to sleep to deal with it. And then I would move on, living my life the exact way I did the day before, when everything fell apart, kind of thing.
Yeah, and there's something I think that you were saying about just the way that we frame or understand failure, and how important it is to recognize that we are all always in progress, right? So I think, for example, in framing things in the right way, which I think you'll see sometimes in, let's say, the startup industry, the tech industry, which will talk about failing often, right, and failing quickly, is a way to learn what's going to work and what's not, right? With moving into new projects without the idea that the first thing I get is going to be the good one, but rather knowing that you're going to have to try a lot of different times before you hit on what's really going to be good. And unless you've really explored and tested things, uh, the mediocre idea that you had at the beginning, if you just stuck with that, will never turn into the brilliant idea that's actually going to be the one that carries the whole company forward. The same, I think, too. It's like, what do we focus on in a way when we talk about leadership and or just action in general? You know, in the sports context, do we only focus on the final result of particular games? Or rather, do we talk about the learning that occurs every time we practice, right? You start out as an athlete, you fail all the time at the beginning. Whatever sport you're doing, the first few years that you're doing it, there's a lot of failure. There's so much mistakes, right? And unless you learn from those mistakes that occur in practice, in games, you never develop in the way that you will ultimately become. I think it's always interesting to note that in the careers of both law and medicine, we refer to them as practicing law, practicing medicine, right? Because there's an awareness that that kind of the wisdom that's being, the knowledge that's being implemented is one that's grounded not in constant certainty, but rather in good judgment in the context of a time. And so I think that we see so much how not having that kind of flexibility of thought is dangerous and challenging uh, in terms of the ability to adapt, especially when things move quickly and when we're not in control.
Absolutely. it's when I think when control is left, that in leadership, there's always this talk about, like I talked about, the formation piece. Um, and I think I brought up briefly earlier that one of the mottos of the course that I teach is we are all servant leaders in training. Kind of the same way. No one ever becomes the perfect servant leader because we all are human. But the foundation piece of the in training part is that you always practice your fundamentals of leadership in every single space, right? Whatever those fundamentals are for you. Um, and I think in the Ignatian contemplative sense, it's that call to think back on what are our mission oriented goals, and if you're someone who's living out the mission to be a person for and with others in the world, that's going to make sure that you're following the right course of action, regardless of the failure or success of what you're doing, because you're still going to have an impact even if your final goal wasn't achieved. And I think for leaders, there's a peace of mind in knowing that when they're proceeding in a way that they've discerned is right, when crises hit, they might not be able to achieve the best version of their goal that they set out to do, but they can still take, I think, a level of peace in the sense that what they set out to achieve still had an impact somewhere, right? They still impacted somewhere down the road, the type of change they wanted to make, even if it's not on the grand scale that they would have hoped for in their wildest dreams, kind of thing. And I think the part of failure is that recognizing that, again, they're going to learn on how to improve for next time, right? Because there's always going to be a next time in leadership. There's always going to be another moment where in your life you can impact others, whether that's a small moment on the next day or another large moment in years to come. There's always going to be another unfolding part of your own chapter and of the lives of others, in which you're going to be called upon to act as a person full of grace and full of wisdom.
And I think that this is, so much of what is passed down from the Ignatian tradition and part of what we hope in Ignatian education. I'll be curious to hear and ask you if there might be some, examples that you could share, either examples from some of the things that you've heard from your students and what you've done, this last semester, or experiences from your own life where some of these elements might be highlighted. I um, often think for me of a moment of crisis. It wasn't external and internal. Was when I kind of made the decision to leave graduate school, and I was studying history. Had been planning and was studying modern European history, a PhD program at UCLA, and that had been my longtime dream to be a history professor. And I came to the point for a number of different reasons where I decided that I wasn't going to continue in that path. There was two clear kind of moments of possibility, let's say. One was mostly one of kind of a darkness of frustration and kind of sadness of loss, right? Combined also with fear of what would I do, who would I be, all these things after so much was wrapped up in this certain goal or identity. And on the other hand was opportunity to try new things, to explore new avenues, right? To believe that there were going to be other things that would give me as much possibility, satisfaction, joy in life that were out there than the path that I had been fixed on for so long. And I'll say it was a very challenge. I wouldn't say that I just grabbed right onto the opportunity. Oh yeah, here we go forward. In fact, I probably was much more in the darkness and fear. But that touch point, that personal crisis, it wasn't any kind of external crisis, but personal crisis is one that's been a touchstone for me for many times, because ultimately it did turn into something that opened me up to new opportunities that were very fulfilling. And so when I look back on it, I can know that yes, in times of great change and uncertainty, there is good that can come. And I try to encourage myself to remember that in those moments, as difficult as it can be to feel it at the time when it feels like so much has been lost. Or I don't know if there's examples or experiences in what you've heard from the students or in your own life that would be related to this topic of discernment and crisis.
Yeah, actually, very, very similar to yours. During the end of my undergraduate career, when I was initially up at Gonzaga, I was in a great. I will say, when I was in undergraduate, I had a really great setup. I was a varsity athlete. I was really excelling in my academics where I was in the honors program there, and through kind of like circumstances out of my control, um, my family had a rather large crisis moment, and it was all through things that were outside of my again, when other people who you're financially dependent upon have things kind of fall apart, it's out of your control completely. Um, and I went from having a kind of like I had built myself my perfect little bubble, and I thought that I had made it, kind of thing. Um, and I had to make the very hard decision rather quickly that I was going to graduate early, and not get a double major I wanted, not get the chance to do some internships that I had really, took almost a year to apply for and build myself into. Um, and I just had to uh, drop a lot of things I was involved with. And I went from, um, having a smaller load of like 19 credits to my last year and a half when I was in school, I took 24 credits a piece, and I like overloaded, and overloaded and overburdened myself. But for the sake of, I only had so much money and so much time left. And the path I had planned out for myself was not going to happen anymore. Um, Luckily, I got, um, I would say I was open to discernment because of a Jesuit I was in spiritual direction with at the time. And he, really challenged me to say, hey, there might be a new opportunity that you have to remain aware of. Because I was really kind of like skulking and, um, you know, I will say complaining to myself and to others that the world's so unjust, all of those things that I think it's easy to get caught in when crises happen and you feel like you have no control left. Um, and it was that really powerful message just coming from my own spiritual director who said, hey, you can't control what's going to happen to you, but you can certainly control how you respond. And to me, that story and that ability to stay in a place to keep my eyes open and my head up in moments of crisis was really something that's been transformative for me. Because every time I do have a failure, I just always tell myself, I'm like, hey, part of this failure was out of your control, and that's okay. And the way you respond to this and the way you move on is what's going to be important, and not the failure itself at the end of the day. So, long story short, because of that mindset, I got lucky enough to kind of figure out that theological grad school was an option for me, instead of kind of the path of law school that I had planned and laid out, and that my internships were all geared towards. So I kind of had to drop one life path that I'd set up in front of me. I had to set that down pretty quickly, and I took up studying theology and seeing Jesuit education as a place that I could call home through that. And that was a really kind of transformative experience for me to figure out that I was able to make something really beautiful out of really kind of the loss of the dream I had had for a long time. So kind of a similar experience of just, you're on a great path that you think is going to be what your definition of success is, and you just kind of have to let it go and walk away from it and deal with the burden that comes with that.
No, that's a great example, and I think so much of what we do draw from are those personal challenges that we confront. As we move towards kind of the end of our time, I'll ask you in just a minute if there might be some, um, words that you share with the students that you think are helpful for people in general, or things that the students have said, because I think so much of that, as you were articulating, has to do with having the right framework for how we view things. So just talking about like that, we're not focused just on um, that. We know that so much of life is in learning from the things that we're practicing, right? Or that failure is a necessary part of development. I think for me, of something that a Jesuit mentor of mine, Father Bill Creed in Chicago, kind of told me in a situation where he asked me to take on more responsibility with some work there. And he said, look, this is an opportunity where I'm there, um, and it's a place where you can learn and grow. And the stakes are not that high. There's a potential for to fail and to learn. And I think that's so important, especially I think for our students, and even in my own life, to know what kind of circumstance am I in, right? Is this a life or death situation, or is this more like I'm in school and I'm learning? And most of the things externally are pretty safe, right? It's
Right.
like there's security out there, and there's people I can turn to ask for help. So that this is a circumstance where I can take some risk, appropriate risk for the situation, so that I can learn, right? It's so important that we take those opportunities when we have them, when we're in those frameworks, like Bill Creed was inviting me to kind of safe risk, so that when we get to those points of real crisis, hopefully never life or death, but those real crises, that then we have the practice of having learned how to make those difficult decisions without all the information in times of crisis, where we're motivated, as Ignatius, I think, always wanted us to be. I mean, as the words of Jesus say, be not afraid, where we're motivated not by fear, but by generosity and a sense of goodness and love for others.
Absolutely. And I think that goes well with this segment of text that I wanted to share, finally, from Leonard Duhan's book again, that I shared out with the guys at the end of this conversation when we had it in our own class. It's that good leaders do not anxiously anticipate crisis and change, but rather they enthusiastically welcome them. For these situations, give leaders significant opportunities to model and to coach others through times of change while preserving the essential characteristics of a shared vision. Um, and I think what lies at the root of that, and like you talked about, it was someone who invited you to a place of being able to fail and being able to learn from those failures. What Duhan finds at the core of his sense of leaders in times of crisis is that leaders are never really alone. It's that falling back on your network and your community of development and support, and recognizing that so many of those larger crises that you're going to face in life oftentimes have to be handled in community. And you might be the one who has to make the decision on it, but still recognizing that you're a part of a community that's going to support you with that and through that. And I think that's just the biggest model that I try to get through to my guys, is that uh, being a leader isn't being a lone wolf. Being a leader is willing to be the prophetic voice in a community and to hopefully let your example inspire those around you in times of crisis. It's not about knowing that you have to do everything, because I think that's what oftentimes is going to lead to more failure than would necessarily be the case. But it's just willing to model all of these behaviors that I think that we've talked about yourself, and hopefully inspire others around you to walk that journey with you at the same time. And I think that's where we find success against this crisis that we find ourselves in right now. I think in our own country, and I think it's a crisis of spirit, is my final thought. That same sense of community and of modeling that I see the Duhan talking about, of welcoming crisis, not alone but together, is where we can find hope. Sometimes in places where it doesn't seem like it's there very much.
Well, thank you, Christian. It's so important, I think, that we do find those places of hope, right? And recognize that um, these are challenges of the spirit, and they're not just abstract decisions that are made, but go to the very core, not just of who we are, uh, but not even just who our society is, but ultimately what God has invited us to be, individually and as people. And so um, we've just scratched the surface here. I think we weren't
Absolutely.
sure when we began exactly what we'd get into, but I think it's clear that we've covered a great ground of some of the big frameworks of how to enter into mindset of how to enter into this topic from an Ignatian perspective of discernment and crisis. There's many more kind of specific elements we could get into, and hopefully we'll have a chance in the future to come back and to take even further applications of these ideas to specific frames and to a particular context as well.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Absolutely.
Um, I know that it's great that you're able to offer this kind of course for our students. It's a wonderful time for them to begin engaging these ideas. I look forward to joining you again for other conversations and with that reminder, as you did, that in the midst of crisis, the important thing is for us to remember that we're invited into discernment, which is directed toward hope and to a spirit that is not guided by fear, but rather the invitation to follow what God has invited us all to.
Yeah, one plug I'll make at the end here. If you want to hear more profound things than anything I can offer, check out the Developing as a Leader podcast that the guys in my class produced this past semester. There's 7 episodes on there about a whole kind of range of topics that go a lot more in depth than we did today on some specific ways I think that are helpful to be a leader in a crisis. The guys did a really good job with them, so feel free to check it out and hear some of the thoughts that I was blessed to hear throughout the semester for yourself. I think they're really worth the listen.
Excellent. Such a great idea. We'll include a little bit of that information at the end of this recording. And so important to see. I think we all learn the more we listen to multiple voices talk through these issues, the more there is to learn. To tie to our theme today, there's always things that are out there for us to learn. We're all practicing right now. And so the more we can learn and grow from our failure, the better, not just for us, but for everyone. So thank you
Absolutely.
for joining us today. Thank you, Christian, again, and look forward to future conversations.